listening to the Sermon Podcast of Brockport First Baptist. We are a progressive American Baptist congregation located about 20 minutes outside of Rochester, New York. To learn more about our church and support our ministries, please visit brockportfirstbaptist.org.
Our scripture reading for today is Exodus 21 through 11. It can be found on page 58 of your pew Bibles. Is that what it says over here? Okay, great. Just making sure. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and the fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. A few years ago, a term began circulating in the public consciousness for workers who decided to do exactly what their job duties entailed and nothing more. This meant no working unpaid hours, no working through legally mandated breaks, no doing extra work that falls outside of one's job description. This became known as quiet quitting. Headline after headline in business publications talked about how employees were disengaged from their jobs and what employers could do to fix the problem. The advice in these articles always seemed to stop short of suggesting that employers actually pay their employees for these heretofore unpaid labor, and that wasn't getting done anymore. In the end, those employees were blamed for lower profits, staffing issues, etc., even though they were doing what they were hired and paid to do. In a similar vein, many job seekers have begun demanding a fair living wage for their jobs. Employers who are not willing to offer living wages find it difficult to find employees. Rather than increase offered compensation, these employers regularly complain that, quote, nobody wants to work anymore. Even locally, we have businesses who are reducing operating hours and publicly blaming people for refusing to accept paltry wages for work. We have a problem in our society with being overworked and underpaid, but we look down upon those who choose not to do uncompensated work or take jobs where the employer values profit over people. A huge part of the problem is that we have decided that work itself is morally good. Consequently, not working, whether that is quiet quitting, demanding fair living wages before accepting a job, or being unable to work for any reason, is morally bad. Holding work and labor up as morally good also shows up when those who rely on social safety nets are regularly denigrated as lazy, freeloaders, and even sinners. Those who don't rely on those same social programs pound their chests and loudly proclaim that they don't need help. We regularly implement laws and rules to make it harder and harder for people who cannot work to receive the bare minimum needed to survive. One only has to look at local news stories and the comments about food stamps to see person after person expressing disgust and disdain for people who need help to feed themselves and their families. Now, this is not a new idea in society. One of the foundational sociological texts is called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by German sociologist Max Weber. In it, he argues that early Protestants in America and the American colonies were deeply invested in knowing and showing that they were destined for heaven when they die. And one of the ways and means to know and show this was to have wealth. The more wealth one had, the more assured they were of their salvation, because it proved that they were blessed by God. For most people, the only way to amass wealth is to work, so those who have wealth are assumed to have a good work ethic. Even those who inherit large amounts of wealth are assumed to have a good and strong work ethic, despite the fact that they don't have to necessarily work for that money. Having a strong work ethic and making a lot of money shows that you are favored by God and therefore likely going to heaven. This desire, this need to show that you are destined for heaven leads good Protestants to work as hard as they can, as long as they can, and to use the wealth gained from this work in a conspicuous manner so that others can see that you are assured of favor with God. Idleness or resting or demanding better pay or working conditions is suspect. These ideas lead to the prosperity gospel industry, where financial blessings are seen as a direct will of God, rewarding those with strong faith, and favor with God can be earned through those same financial blessings. But if God rewards the faithful and good people with financial stability, then the next logical step is those who struggle financially are not faithful or good enough. Work, regardless of what that work entails, is morally good. Not working, regardless of the reason, is morally bad. But today's reading belies these ideas by challenging our ideas of work and rest. Now let's begin by looking at that actual commandment again. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slaves, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. The Sabbath, which might be Saturday or might be Sunday, depending on who you are, is holy. Holy means something that is set apart by God, something special. God set a day apart from all the other days as something special, and what is important here is that it is a specific day in a cycle of days that is set apart. People, including those who aren't part of God's chosen people, are to refrain from labor on this special set-apart day. Going beyond even people, livestock are supposed to refrain from work, however that works out for you. So no work on the Sabbath. That seems pretty clear. Then we move on to the rationale for this day being set apart as special. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. God modeled this for us in the creation story. God labored for 6 days and then rested on the seventh day. By resting on that day, God blessed it and made it holy. So that's the commandment. Everybody and everything is commanded to rest on a holy day that comes along in a regular cycle, just as God rested after the creation of the world. So it doesn't actually sound all that difficult to understand. Rest like God rested. This commandment has been enforced in many ways. In biblical times, the rest was strictly enforced. Absolutely no work was supposed to be done. No gathering of food, no training or deployment of soldiers, even as far as to bar the lighting of fires for cooking. Now, before moving on, I want to point out that this commandment requires that the people have faith that God will provide. If you aren't supposed to harvest food on the Sabbath, then that means you must be able to complete your harvest and harvest enough food on all the other days to survive. If God's people cannot train or deploy soldiers in times of conflict, then that means they have one less day to prepare for their enemies. But it also requires faith in your employer. If you do not work on the Sabbath or any other day that you have off, then your compensation from the other days has to be enough to live on. Now, going back to the restrictions, in modern times, we see technology such as Sabbath modes on ovens that allow strict adherence to the commandment to use their oven without any lights, sounds, or needing to adjust anything on it so they can cook food. Because remember, you weren't supposed to light fires on the Sabbath. We also see so-called blue laws that originated in Europe and spread to American colonial times that limited commercial business activity on Sundays. While many of these blue laws have been struck down or repealed, some, such as restrictions on alcohol sales, either outright or during limited hours on Sundays, still remain in many places. But now I want to look at the actual instance that is the basis of the commandment, as well as how it was interpreted by Jesus himself. So first, we should look at the creation story, the creation of the Sabbath in Genesis. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed, it was very good. The heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. On the sixth day, God finished the work he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. So God set out to create the heavens and the earth. At the end of the sixth day, God looked at everything, saw it was good and finished, and then God rested. God was done with the work at hand. He saw it was good and rested. God didn't see that the job at hand had been completed and immediately looked for more work to do. Certainly, God could have found another task that needed doing, but God saw that the task that he had set upon was done and good, and that was enough. We also aren't told that God had worked until the point of exhaustion before stopping to rest. We are told that God chose to rest. We also do not see God retreating from creation to rest in isolation. God doesn't go into hibernation or deep sleep. God simply rests. So if we rest like God rested, then we too shouldn't wait until we can work no more before we stop to rest. Rest doesn't have to be an inevitable consequence of taking on more and more tasks until our bodies just cannot go anymore. Rest should be something that is a regular, set part of our cycle of work. Do the work that we set out to do, and when it is done and good, step back and rest. But what should that rest actually look like? Instead of looking closer at those rules and regulations that our ancient forebears enacted in response to this commandment, let's look at how Jesus observed the Sabbath. Spoiler alert, Jesus doesn't follow the rules. One of Jesus' frequent violations of the restrictions placed upon people by the religious authorities was that he frequently healed people on the Sabbath. This would seem to go against the rule that no labor take place. For even though the work of healing wasn't what we think of today with doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals, if God's creation of everything was work, then surely Jesus' healing ministry, miracles would be work as well. In Luke, Jesus heals a woman who had suffered for 18 years. The religious authorities said, "There are 6 days on which the work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered them and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it to water?" He then goes on to say that if you're allowed to care for God's creation by giving water, then surely you can care for God's creation by healing. In this way, Jesus establishes that care for all that God created is permissible on the Sabbath. We see this again in Matthew, when Jesus heals a man's withered hand on the Sabbath. Right on cue, the religious authorities challenge this act as working on the Sabbath. Returning to his tactic we saw in Luke, Jesus presents a scenario that is accepted as allowable on the Sabbath. He says, suppose one of you has only one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Like his example of giving your livestock water, Jesus points out that caring for God's creation is allowed on the Sabbath. He goes one step further here by explicitly saying that pulling your animal out of the pit on the Sabbath is good, and doing good is always permissible. Healing the man's hand, therefore, is good and is always permissible, even on the Sabbath. In John, Jesus heals a paralyzed man on the Sabbath and commands him to stand up, pick up his mat that he had been laying on, and walk. Again, the religious authority had a problem with this. They first challenged the man, saying, it is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat. And then they turn to persecute Jesus, and they say, and they start persecuting Jesus for the same act. Here we see Jesus use a slightly different tack. He answers them, my Father is still working, and I am also working. So here we are told very clearly that despite what we heard in Genesis and the original commandment, it's not necessarily correct to assume that God continues to rest on the Sabbath, or maybe that rest and work aren't as simply defined as we have tried to do, calling into question whether God actually needed to rest on the Sabbath, or even what constitutes work and rest. Jesus has made it clear time and time again that healing is permissible on the Sabbath, but lest we conclude that healing isn't work, and that's why it's allowed, here Jesus dispels that notion by saying that yes, healing is work, and yet it's still allowed. Finally, in Mark, the religious leaders are at it again to call out Jesus and his followers about their actions on the Sabbath. This time, as they were walking through fields of wheat, his followers, who were hungry, picked some of the wheat and ate it. The religious authorities asked, or said, look what they are doing. Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now remember, harvesting food was against the rules. So once again, Jesus is taken to task. Like leading your animal to water on the Sabbath, this seems to be a clear instance of caring for God's creation. So Jesus could have used that as a defense. These people were hungry, so they ate. But instead, Jesus tells them, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. By this, Jesus means that the Sabbath was created and made holy by God for humans as a gift, not as a rigid set of rules to limit humankind. Like giving water or healing, allowing the hungry to gather food on the Sabbath is in keeping with the idea that the Sabbath is a gift of grace to the people. So what does all this mean? First, the Sabbath is a time of holy rest, and God modeled this for us in Genesis. Holy rest isn't the rest that we begrudgingly grant the ill or the overworked. It is meant as a regular part of the cycle of our labor and life. Number two, God's holy rest wasn't withdrawn and passive. It is active and present, just as God remained present while resting and continues to work in and on creation. Number three, just as God's work of mercy and healing continues on the Sabbath, so should our works of mercy and healing. That care for creation is work, and that work is never done. And finally, the Sabbath is a gift from God to give us permission to also take holy rest. It is a reminder that labor and profit should not be unceasing. Regular cyclical resting and caring for ourselves and others are part of God's plan for creation, as God and Jesus modeled. Amen.